I made these illustrations in just 30 minutes each. But how did I manage to create a cityscape in minutes? Well, there is a technique for it which I'm going to show you in this video. But first things first, you'll need to understand what makes these buildings look like buildings. After all, these are just some messy brushstrokes if we view them up close. But if we zoom out, ta-da! After watching this video, hopefully you'll have a much better understanding of how to simplify imagery and visually communicate ideas with minimal brushwork and lesser time. So without wasting any more time,
let's do this.
So here I have a picture of a city, and as you can see, it is made up of a lot of shapes, big and small shapes, rectangles, triangles, squares and domes. In addition to the smaller shapes, we also have a silhouette of this city line. So we have some rough silhouette of the distant buildings and some rough silhouette of the buildings in the midground. I've highlighted the distant silhouette with a green color, and I've used the blue color for the buildings in the midground. So you can also separate them to understand perspective. So for now, we understand that there is a basic silhouette of the city. There are basic shapes like square, rectangles, triangles, and now we need to understand the lights and dark shapes. So if I convert this image into a black and white image and I play with the levels a bit, in a way that I push the darker areas to a more darker value and the lighter areas to a more lighter value, we basically need to convert this into a two-tone image with only blacks and whites left. So let's do that with the levels. And now we have a black and white image, and you can clearly see the shapes right now. All the areas where the light is hitting, it's in white, and all the shadow areas are in the black color. So as you can see, even if we convert this into a very simple visual, we can still understand where the buildings are, where the light is hitting, where the shadows are. Everything is clearly visually readable. So if we were to emulate the same thing in a painting, all we need is a silhouette of the buildings, maybe separate silhouettes for the buildings in the back and the buildings in the midground and the buildings in the foreground, and we need to create different shapes of lights and darks. I know it's easier said than done, but I'll show you a demo. So let's quickly make a selection and create some sort of a silhouette. You can also use the brush for that. I don't really have to be very accurate with the silhouette, and I'm doing this without reference, but if you could use references for this, the results will be amazing, since the architecture or the shape language would be much closer to real life. So I am just painting a bunch of vertical shapes, some domes, and now I have the silhouette ready. The silhouette is basically comprised of all the dark areas. Now we just need to add blocky shapes for the lighter areas, and for that I'll select a lighter gray color and add some light shapes. I'm using a rectangular brush, which makes my life easier because it's easier to get these vertical strokes with this brush. I'm just adding a bunch of different blocky shapes to suggest buildings. And as you can see, I'm making sure that the strokes are of different sizes. These lighter shapes should not look all the same, and I can always go back to the darker color to carve out the shapes and maybe add some windows and stuff like that. You can always add the details later. And as you can see, we can already see some volume. We can see that there is a silhouette and there are some shadows, and within these shadows we can see some blocky shapes which look like buildings from a distance. Once you have the lighter and darker tones done, you can also select some mid-tones to paint some of the areas. So yeah, that's pretty much it. This is the technique that I sometimes used for speed painting cityscapes and buildings. So you don't really need to paint each and every brick and detail, but only the lights and darks and the overall shape. And only that can effectively visually communicate a city or a lot of buildings. Okay, so now I'm sure a lot of you must be thinking, but Imad, this looks very flat. It's not in perspective. It's easier to do this in 2D, but what if we want to make a cityscape with a perspective? Which brings it to my second technique. It uses pretty much the same principle of using lighter and darker blocky shapes, but we'll do that in perspective instead of a flat surface. And for this technique, I'll just make lots of boxes on a plain surface, and I'll be using a selection tool for that. You can make sure that these boxes are of different sizes and shapes, maybe some rectangles in there, some are smaller, some are bigger. Imagine that you are viewing the city buildings from a top view. So once the selections are made, I'll just fill it in with a gray color, and now once I have the top view, I'll just skew it, transform it, and add some sort of a perspective to it, like it's going into a distance. Pretty much the same way how you manipulate a photo into perspective. So now we can see that our squares and rectangles are going into perspective. These would act as the rooftops of the buildings. Next, I'll just paint with a plain color underneath these boxes. So I'm filling it in with a gray color. And now I'll just need to paint different faces of the cubes. So imagine that these rectangles are the top side of a box shape. And all we need to do is to paint the other faces or the other sides of these boxes. So for the other faces, I'll be using some darker values. And to make it easier, firstly, I'm going to paint the side of the box that is facing towards me, and I'll be painting that with a darker value. And as you can see, it has already started to look 3D. And right now, don't worry about the fact that there is no atmospheric perspective in this one, because we can always add that later. And also, I know that these buildings are all the same size, which is no problem at all, because we're gonna fix that too. Now we already have some 3D blocky shapes laid out in perspective, and all we need to do is to add some size variations in these buildings. So I'm just going to stretch some of the buildings and make them longer. I'm also making sure that I am using different values for different sides of these shapes. And now, as you can see, we already have some size variations in the buildings. Some look taller than the others. And these are basically just box shapes all jumbled together. We can also add some atmospheric perspective using a soft round brush. So I'm using a soft round brush, selecting a lighter value and just painting over the distant buildings, which gives us a sense of depth and atmospheric perspective. Now remember how we talked about the silhouettes from the first photo? Looks like we have some buildings in the midground, but there is still room for more buildings in the background. So we can just add a silhouette of some more buildings that are farther in the distance. So I'm just going to select a very lighter value and paint those buildings. I'm using lighter values to suggest that they are at a greater distance. And you can just use eraser and brush tool to just carve out different shapes until you are happy with how it looks. Again, I'm not using reference for these, so some of these might look janky, but if you could use reference, you could design these buildings a lot better. And it doesn't matter if these are sci-fi buildings or medieval buildings, the technique is the same for any genre that you like. And as you can see, I'm using even more lighter values to paint more of these buildings in the distance. Now you can always go back and carve out these shapes, because obviously these are very rough at the moment, but you can carve out these shapes, make them smoother around the edges. Now we have the main structure done, and that's the most technical and probably the trickiest part. But once this is established, adding details on top of this or changing the architecture, it's not a big deal. So once you have this perspective down and the composition and the blocky shapes, you can always go back and add more architectural details, like the design for the rooftops and some balconies and windows and all the other details on the buildings. You can also use these blocky brush strokes to suggest windows in these buildings. And as you can see, it's already looking a bit more detailed. Of course, it's not photorealistic because it's a speed paint, but you can show this to anyone and they would perfectly understand that this is a scene of a city. So with this technique, you can quickly show a complex scene with lots of buildings or structures without spending too much time or compositing it in some 3D software. You can quickly get the idea across. You can always adjust the curves to set the values and correct the contrast later on. So you can make the darks even darker and the lights even down lighter, use different blending modes to even add color on top of this grayscale image. The possibilities are endless. So now that you've watched and understood the technique, let me show it to you in action. I'm going to use the same techniques of using lighter and darker blocky shapes to create some speed paints. You can view them, understand its different applications, and possibly learn from them. All of these speed paints are different, so I'm sure you'll find a lot of value in them. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of the video.